The following episode is sponsored by Lux Brand. Lux Brand is a lifestyle brand that is all about living life to the absolute finest, and I convinced them that my Leather Helmet Mafia live their lives to the absolute finest and love looking good while doing it. With Valentine's Day right around the corner, Lux offers the fine living gifts for the man or woman in your life. And if you screwed up on Valentine's Day, well, Lux offers up the best makeup gifts. And if you enter the coupon code LHMAFIA when you make your order, my Mafia members get 20% off. So click on the link in the description below and give them a look. Now, on to the video. In 1923, the then 6-year-old National Hockey League was looking to expand in the United States. The result would be 3 new teams. The Boston Bruins in 1924, followed in 1925 by the Pittsburgh Pirates, and then the team we will be profiling today, the New York Americans. Promoters Thomas Duggan and Tex Rickard teamed with infamous Prohibition bootlegger Bill Dwyer to put together a team to fill the brand new Madison Square Garden. Finding players turned out not to be a problem for the trio, as the Hamilton Tigers had ceased operations the previous year, and instead of simply buying the rights of the team, they chose to purchase the contracts of all the players in probably one of the most extreme and earliest forms of free agency. Oddly enough, Hamilton had done the exact same thing in 1920, when the Quebec Bulldogs ceased their operations. One of the reasons the Hamilton Tigers ceased operations following the 1924 season was that the players refused to play in the playoffs without a pay raise, and both the owners and the league refused. Despite having a team that finished the prior season with the league's best record and getting paid what they felt they deserved, the results on the ice were not pretty. Over the next 17 seasons, the team would amass a record of 255 wins, 402 losses, and 127 ties, going to the playoffs 5 times, finishing with a playoff record of 6-11. They would finish last in their division 6 times, next to last 7 times, and dead last in the league 4 times. While the team underachieved on the ice and wins came at a premium, the team had its fair share of talented players. Here are a few of the more notable New York Americans. Perhaps no man symbolizes the Americans more than center Normie Himes, who played his entire 9-year career with them. He is the team's all-time leader in games played, goals, and points. Himes scored 3 hat tricks and is ranked 4th in team history in assists. He was a 3-time finalist for the Lady Byng Trophy and a 1-time finalist for the Hart Trophy. After spending his first 3.5 seasons with the Bruins, center Art Chapman spent his final 6.5 years taking faceoffs for the Americans. He's the team's all-time leader in assists, 8th in games played, and 4th in points. He was a 2-time finalist for the Lady Byng Trophy and represented the Americans in the NHL All-Star Game in 1936. Left winger Sweeney Schriner began his Hall of Fame career with New York, and even then, he had the scoring touch before spending his final 6 seasons with the Maple Leafs. In his 240 games with the Americans, he would score 4 hat tricks, the most in the franchise's history. He is 3rd all-time in goals in Americans' history, 3rd in assists, and 2nd in points. He was a 2-time All-Star for New York and a finalist for both the Lady Byng and Hart Trophy in 1935. Right winger Lorne Carr spent his first 8 years with the Americans before moving on to Toronto and winning 2 Stanley Cups in the 1940s. While with New York, he tallied some impressive numbers on the team's all-time leaderboard, ranking 3rd in games played, 2nd in goals, 5th in assists, and 3rd in points. And he accomplished all that without scoring a hat trick for the franchise. Defenseman Red Dutton was well on his way to the Hockey Hall of Fame when he was traded to the Americans at the age of 33 before the 1931 season, and he would spend his last 6 seasons as the team's enforcer. He would end up having the most penalty minutes in the franchise's history, and he would end up being a finalist for the Hart Trophy at the age of 38. How good could a 5'3", 135-pound goalie really be? Well, in Roy "Shrimp" Worters' case, he would play between the pipes for 9 seasons for the Americans, go to 2 All-Star games, be a finalist for the Hart Trophy, which he had already won as a member of the Pittsburgh Pirates earlier in his career, win the Vezina, and end up in the Hockey Hall of Fame. He would lead the franchise all-time in games played by a goalie, wins, losses, ties, and shutouts. A total of 5 players wore a C on their sweater for the Americans from 1925 until 1942. Center Billy Birch from 1925 until 1932. Defenseman Red Dutton from 1932 to 1936. Left winger Sweeney Schriner from 1936 until 1939. Right winger Charles the Big Bomber Conacher from 1939 until 1941. And defenseman Tom Cowboy Anderson from 1941 until the team disbanded in 1942. The Americans had 8 different head coaches during their existence. Here's a look at all of them. Tommy Gorman had 2 non-consecutive 1-year stints as New York's head coach, one in 1925 and again in 1928. His overall record was 31 wins, 33 losses, and 16 ties. Newsy Lalonde took over for Gorman in 1926, but only lasted for one forgettable 17, 25, and 2 season. Shorty Green lived up to his name after taking over the team following Lalonde's exit, as he would also only last 1 season, finishing with an abysmal 11, 27, and 6 record. Following Tommy Gorman's second run as head coach, the team turned to one of Canada's greatest athletes, Lionel Conacher. While Lionel would end up in the Hockey Hall of Fame for his play on the ice, his coaching off of it was pretty dismal, and he would last only 1 season, going 14, 25, and 5. The Americans finally caught a break when they were able to obtain the services of Eddie Gerard going into the 1930 season. To this day, Gerard is heralded as one of the greatest hockey players ever to come out of Canada. He would spend 2 seasons in New York before leaving to take an office job with the Montreal Maroons, but in those 2 years, he won nearly half of his games, going 34, 40, and 18, bringing the team out of the laughingstock and into respectability. New York decided to promote from within after Gerard's departure, naming defenseman Bullet Joe Simpson as player coach, where he would handle both duties for the next 3 seasons. In that time, the team would be competitive, but never in a position to threat for a playoff spot. He would end up going 42, 72, and 30. Simpson would be replaced in 1935 by Rosie Helmer, who was involved in the Americans' front office. In his lone season as head coach, he would lead the team to a 16, 25, and 7 season. But that was good enough to get New York back into the playoffs for the first time in 6 years. The Americans would once again hire from within, naming team captain, defenseman Red Dutton, as player coach. It was a move they would not regret. Dutton would be the franchise's winningest coach, going 66, 97, and 29 over 4 seasons, taking the Americans to the playoffs in 3 of them. With the onset of World War II and the team having trouble staying afloat financially, Red Dutton moved to the Americans' front office, naming Art Chapman as the team's head coach. He would end up being the team's final head coach, and their end was not a pretty one, as lack of talent due to the draft and financial limitations stripped New York of talent. Chapman would end up going 24, 58, and 14, as the team would never return to the playoffs. The New York Americans were the first professional sports franchise to call the third Madison Square Garden home. The building would become a landmark in downtown Manhattan, operating from 1925 until 1968. The Americans would play a total of 439 games there, winning 171 games, losing 192, and having 76 ties. They scored 984 goals and allowed 1,082, an average of 2.24 goals for and 2.46 goals against. Duggan, Rickard, and Dwyer knew that in order to fill the brand new Madison Square Garden, the first taste would have to be with the eye, so they had the uniforms patterned after the American flag. For the time, the uniforms seemed gaudy and audacious, but in my personal opinion, they are some of the most eye-catching and most amazing sweaters in the history of the game. The seeds of doom for the New York Americans sprouted from the floor of the very arena that they played in. Tex Rickard, who had been instrumental in the creation of the Americans, saw that there was big money with hockey in New York City, and easily gained franchise rights from the NHL to have a second team play in the Garden. Rickard's team, the New York Rangers, started playing only 1 season after the Americans in 1926. The two teams shared a heated rivalry, which by 1940, the Americans were on the verge of winning. But the onset of World War II changed everything. With the team suffering from intense debt, they were forced to trade away their best players, allowing the Rangers to take a foothold in New York City. In a desperate move, the team announced that they were moving to Brooklyn, and even changed the name of the team in 1941 to the Brooklyn Americans, despite the fact that they were still playing in Madison Square Garden. After the season, the team ceased operations with plans to restart operations once the war was over and they had established an arena in Brooklyn. That would never happen. Brooklyn would not have an NHL franchise until the New York Islanders moved to the Barclays Center from Long Island in 2015. 73 years after the Americans announced that they would play there. Rumor has it that Red Dutton placed a curse on the New York Rangers, swearing that they would not win a Stanley Cup again in his lifetime. This curse would become a reality, as the Rangers would not win the Cup until 1994, 7 years after Dutton died. The logo and uniforms and nickname of the Americans live on in the American Hockey League, whose Rochester Americans have won 6 Calder Cups since 1956, while wearing a very similar logo and uniform. And that is the story of the New York Americans, a colorful footnote in the history of the NHL. While their failures outnumbered their victories, they did introduce professional hockey to the United States' largest media market. If you have any stories about the Americans that you'd like to share, please feel free to post them in the comment section. Perhaps your grandfather or your great-grandfather went to see them. Maybe they even played for or worked for them. These stories are carried on down through the generations. These franchises will only last as long as we choose to remember them. Thank you for the view, and I'll catch you on the next Forgotten Franchises.